Okay, for today's lecture, we'll be talking about the memory half of this section. So before we get into memory, though, I want to talk a bit about attention, because before you can actually form a memory, you have to attend to the material. So originally we had Donald Broadbent's theory, and basically the idea here was that if you're around some sort of stimuli, you're either attending to it or you're not. It's an all or nothing type deal. So an all or none selection device. Either the material is being attended to or the material is being completely filtered out and not attended to. Anne Treisman, on the other hand, took this a step further. So as we've seen in the past, researchers tend to build upon each other. One researcher will develop a theory and test that theory over and over again, and then over time, other researchers will tweak it and continue to test it, that kind of stuff. So we see that with Treisman adding on to Broadbent's theory. So she believed that it wasn't an all or nothing thing, that attention was more selective. So if you're in a room and maybe people are talking around you, that kind of thing, that stimuli is either being attended to and processed, or it's just kind of turned down in the background, if that makes sense. So either background noise, conversation, or attended to conversation, but not all or nothing. And this is called the dichotic listening paradigm. Well, the types of studies she did to look at this model of attention were the dichotic listening paradigm studies. So she would have participants come into her lab and wear headphones with different messages being played in the different ears. And she would have one ear with an attended message and the other ear with an unattended message. The idea being that the participant is listening to or attending to, processing the message that is being played through the attended ear and kind of filtering out, turning down, not attending so much to the unattended ear, if that makes sense. So she believed that incoming information is processed through a series of tests, with the first test being sensory qualities, the second being phoneme syllables or visual shapes, and the third being meaning and implication. So given this conceptualization of attention being stuff going on around you, stimuli, being either turned down or fully attended to, what will result in said stimuli becoming attended to? And she believed that that was it passing through these three phases or these three tests. So messages that pass the test will be analyzed at a deeper level. And that's going in order. So starting with number 1 and going to 3, 3 being information that is analyzed deeply. So with her studies with the attended and unattended ear, the ear that was attended to, the participants would be asked to repeat the message. And this is called shadowing, because what they're saying is shadowing the message being heard, right? So that's how the researchers knew that they were actually attending to that ear, because they were having to do something by repeating the message. So what they found was participants typically couldn't answer many questions regarding the unattended ear because that message was turned so far down and not processed, right? But they could tell researchers if the unattended ear changed from like male to female, so like that big of a difference. They couldn't tell if it changed language, but male to female, that change in the sensory quality did stand out. So usually what we see is like number 1 is pretty easily detected. And then as we go along, it becomes more difficult to detect that information, unless the signal is really, really bright. So an example of this would be like your name. That means a lot to you, right? So it stands out. It's a very bright signal, and it's going to immediately jump to number 3 pretty much anytime you slightly hear your name being said in a filtered out conversation. So for example, if you're at a party, everything's loud, you're definitely turning down everything around you and only paying attention to, only processing, attending the conversation you're in, right? But if you hear your name across the room, even if it's said kind of lightly and not very loudly, it's going to snap your attention to it, right? So even though you're not processing what's going around you, you're still kind of attending to it. It's just turned way down, and that bright signal of your name jumps up to the meaning and implication test. It passes it pretty much every single time. Other things that might pass are like something you find very interesting, or maybe if you hear a friend's name, these types of things that mean more to you. Another thing that they found was that when participants were asked to listen to an attended ear and shadow it, and then kind of tune out the unattended ear, when they played the same exact message in both ears, just separated, they saw some interesting stuff. So if the unattended ear, so the one they're not supposed to be paying attention to, if that message comes after the attended ear, so the one that they're shadowing, the detection takes place. They realize, oh, hey, this is the same message twice, when the two messages are only 5 seconds apart. On the other hand, if the unattended ear comes before the attended ear, they have to be 1.5 seconds apart. So they need to be much closer because it's harder to detect. It's harder for the participant to notice, hey, these are the same messages, which makes sense because if they've already attended the message, that means they've already processed that information. So when they hear it again, even though they're not really paying attention, it's kind of tuned out or turned down in the unattended ear, it's going to pass these tests quicker because they've already found meaning in the message. They've already processed it. It's very salient to them, if that makes sense. Okay, and that was Treisman's model of attention, and she used the dichotic listening paradigm to test it. So now that we've talked about attention a bit, we'll talk about memory. So before we can actually remember something, we have to acquire that information. And this is called either acquisition or encoding or learning. So this is any time new information is being presented to you. Then after the information has been presented to you, you've learned it, that kind of stuff, this information is encoded into storage. And this way you can kind of hold it there. And then whenever you need to call upon that information, you can retrieve the memory. So if you think about this information you're hearing right now, you're hopefully encoding quite a bit of the information that I'm giving you. You've already read it, right? So you have a lot of this stuff, information regarding psychology and memory and that kind of thing that's being held in your storage so that you can retrieve that information when you sit down to take your exam. So encoding, storage, retrieval. So we just kind of talked about this, but once again, we have encoding. That's like the learning stage of the memory process. That's when information is being encoded into you, right? You're learning it. And how information is treated by the brain to form a stable representation that can be brought back to the mind. So that when you retrieve the information and you remember it, it's kind of brought back to the forefront of your mind and you can reprocess it again. So why is memory so important? Usually I'll kind of ask the class about this, what you guys think, because there's no right or wrong answer. But overall, some themes that I usually hear are that memory is important because it basically makes up who we are as individuals. So we are a product of all of our experiences, interactions with others, knowledge we've gained over the years, just basic experiences we've had. And without memory, who would we be? Because that makes up a lot of who we are. It also helps us to make sense of the world, to make plans about the future based on, information we already know. So memory is a huge part of who we are. And if you can imagine, if you didn't have your memories anymore, life would be very difficult. It would be very confusing. You wouldn't be able to get to class. You wouldn't be able to remember your friends, your family, what you like, what you don't like. It'd be very difficult to make any decisions. So memory is a huge and vital part of our lives. So here's a visual representation of what I just discussed in terms of memory being acquired and then stored and then retrieved. So this is mainly the storage process. So we have some sort of environmental input. So maybe you're hearing this lecture, that kind of thing. That would be auditory, right? You're viewing it, so you see this diagram, that'd be visual. Haptic would be touch. So we have the sensory input coming in, and then it's going to go to short-term storage. So this would be that information that you're rehearsing in the moment. Maybe you're making a decision right now, making a strategy, like it's very short-term. And if it's not attended to within 30 seconds or so, it's going to be lost, it's going to disappear. But if you continue to attend to it, you can eventually store it into long-term storage. So a huge example right here for short-term storage would be like someone's giving you a phone number to remember and regurgitate real quick. So you're probably going to rehearse it a few times, but after you give the phone number back to that person, you're not going to rehearse the phone number anymore, and it will eventually decay, because if you don't use it, you lose it. However, if that phone number is something you want to remember and you practice it and maybe connect it to some things you already know, make a mnemonic device, that kind of thing, it will eventually move into long-term storage. So studying for an exam, that kind of thing. If you just read through the material one time and you didn't really process it or think it through as you're reading it or connect it to things you already know, all of that stuff, it's likely to be lost due to decay, right? But if you continue to read the material, listen to the lecture, take notes, try to make connections, talk with your classmates about all of these things, the more likely that information is to enter into long-term storage, which is a permanent memory store. And it appears that long-term storage is relatively unlimited in capacity and pretty permanent. That is, unless you develop something like Alzheimer's or dementia, or you have a brain injury or something like that. But other than that, long-term storage is pretty permanent. Unless you haven't retrieved information, if something stays in memory and retrieval for 3 or more years, you probably won't forget it. So if you haven't retrieved it in less than 3 years, it's not that important to you, that kind of thing. Once again, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. But overall, if you commit something to long-term storage and you access it fairly frequently, it's going to stay there likely forever. Another thing to keep in mind with short-term storage is that we can hold about 4 to 5 unrelated words in short-term storage at a time. And once again, this is short-term, right? Remember that. If the information is about 20 to 25 words that are related to each other, so say a sentence, a song lyric, a rhyme, that kind of thing, we can remember much more, 20 to 25 bits of information or words. So you can see a difference there with unrelated words being much less storage capacity, and related words or sentences you can remember much more. Which you can think about that like with song lyrics, that kind of thing. Each word kind of reminds you of the next word, and so on and so forth. Alan Badley, who's another huge name with memory research, found that acoustically distinct letter strings are easier to remember. So an example of this would be, it's much easier to remember something like P, V, G, D, C, E, T than it is to remember something like A, P, X, I, O, Q, R, X. That would be much more difficult to remember. And then another thing in terms of short-term memory that's interesting is Miller's short-term memory capacity. So Miller found that there's this magic number 7 and then plus or 2. So 7 numbers are, that's kind of the magic number for remembering, which is likely why phone numbers here are 7 numbers, right? 7 digits. And then 6 letters and 5 words. That's kind of our memory capacity overall on average. Okay. So Tulving, yet another big name in memory, has 5 types of long-term memory that he's conceptualized, but we're only going to talk about 3 in class, and 3 are usually the only ones that are discussed anyways. So the first is semantic memory, and these are all of our facts, meaning, concepts, knowledge about the world, that kind of thing. So an example would be like knowing the grass is green, knowing what a dog is, knowing what semantic memory is, all of this information you're learning in class, that would be semantic memory. The second type is episodic memory. So this is any memory you have of a specific event or specific experience that's subjective to you. So this is very personal, recalling your first day of school, your personal dog's name, that kind of thing. And this allows us to place ourselves in the past or the future. So typically what we see is episodic memory comes first, followed by semantic, which makes sense. So usually, if you have an episodic memory of an event, that's going, like your dog's name, that will result in kind of this knowledge of facts, that kind of thing, like what a dog is, what breed your dog was, maybe something like that. And then if you flip it around the other way, usually when you have a memory, let's say of learning information in this class, maybe you're sitting down, you're taking your exam, and you're thinking, oh, I know this information. And then you may kind of go back to 2 weeks before, sitting in your seat in the classroom, and you may remember some of the details of what the slide kind of layout looked like and learning that information. So that would be episodic, personally subjectively, what you remember seeing, and then semantic would be the information that was on that slide that you learned, those facts. So usually when you have semantic memory, you have an episodic memory of learning that information. And then the third is procedural memory, so how to do something. And here's a nice little visual. So we have procedural memories, that's knowing how to do something like riding a bike, declarative memories, and the 2 types, so semantic, which is general knowledge, facts, that kind of thing, and then episodic, which is more subjective and personal recollections. So if a person possesses some semantic or general knowledge, memory information, he obviously must have learned it, either directly or indirectly at an earlier time, but he need not possess any mnemonic information about the episode of such learning. So what does that mean? Basically, what Tulving is getting at here is that if someone has a memory of facts, if you have knowledge, that doesn't necessarily mean you remember learning that information, that you remember the personal and subjective moment of gaining that semantic memory. So yes, you may know that the grass is green. You have that general knowledge, but that doesn't mean that you remember the exact moment that you were taught that the grass was green, right? And that is called source amnesia. So remembering facts, but not remembering how or when you learned them. And we're going to go to Elizabeth Loftus's TED Talk. So one of the studies or 2 studies we read actually for today's lecture were by Elizabeth Loftus, and she's a huge name when it comes to false memories, misinformation, that kind of stuff. So we'll watch this video. I don't think this link works. It should be right here, I believe. But if you want to, you can watch it here in the slide, or in this video, or you can Google and YouTube Elizabeth Loftus TED Talk. Sorry, guys. Okay, so Elizabeth Loftus discussed the misinformation effect. So this is that idea that reports about an earlier event are influenced by misinformation that the person received after experiencing the event. And in extreme cases, this can lead to false memories. And we'll talk about this right now. So she gave a lot of examples of her many studies, like the stop sign versus the yield sign. I believe she talked about the smashing of the cars. So how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, or how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? And that word after the fact, after viewing the film, of smashed or hit can lead to a change in the memory, a false memory. So the misinformation after the fact can change the memory. So those who heard the question smashed tended to report seeing broken glass even when there wasn't any. So they kind of, because of hearing this word afterwards, that misinformation, this affected their memory. And part of that was that they kind of developed a new visual for that memory, if that makes sense. So, and this happens in day-to-day life too. We tend to fill in details if there are any missing pieces, stories, things like that. And it's called the construction hypothesis. So we visualize an incident to answer a question, and we can add information to it or reconstruct the memory so that it matches the presupposition. So for this example with the cars, hearing the word smashed, that's kind of changing the way we visualize the accident, the video that we'd watched, our memory, and that leads to us kind of morphing it so that it matches with the question and the word smashed. Another one she used was how tall or how short was the basketball player. Those who were asked how tall reported that the basketball player was taller on average than those who were asked how short. Other examples are like, do you have a headache often, or do you have a headache frequently? And if you're asked frequently, I believe, you're more likely to say that you have a headache more than you would if you were asked often. Numbers, that kind of thing. If you're asked, were there 12 people in the room, as opposed to were there 4 people in the room, like last week? If you were asked a higher number, you're more likely, on average, that group that's asked a higher number will report a higher number of people that they remembered seeing, as opposed to participants in groups asked if they saw a lower number of people, like say 4, will report on average less people being in the group or in the room the week before. So we can kind of prime an answer by giving information after the fact, very kind of sleuthily, like sneaking it in there in order to develop false memories. Another thing I did want to add, we're more susceptible to the misinformation effect and in turn having false memories created when the memory that we have has begun to fade or if it's not strong enough. So that could be like a child, that kind of thing. Those memories typically aren't as strong. So memory is more susceptible to being modified by young children, by someone with maybe dementia or Alzheimer's, that kind of thing. Basically, any memory that's not very strong and that's already begun to fade is more susceptible to being reconstructed. So Elizabeth Loftus mentioned the Innocence Project at one point, and you can Google that. There's a website for the Innocence Project that lists many, many, many cases, kind of like case studies of individuals who have been freed from the prison system due to lawyers, psychologists, social workers, all kinds of individuals who volunteer to help out those who have been wrongfully accused. So faulty eyewitness memory is responsible for 75% of wrongful convictions. In cross-racial identifications, we see that identification ability is significantly increased. So we see the most issues there. And a huge case that became very, very famous was Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson. So Jennifer Thompson, and there's a video link here, you can watch it. She was a college student, and a man entered her house and raped her. And while this took place, she reports that she really studied and visualized, to get a good representation of who her attacker was so that she could put him behind bars afterwards. And Jennifer Thompson fell victim to the misinformation effect, and this was due to multiple things like the way she was questioned, that kind of stuff. The fact that Ronald Cotton actually did look quite a bit like her actual perpetrator. And then over time, as she kept seeing Ronald Cotton's face, she began to kind of morph her memory um, to incorporate his face into it, which just led to her being more and more confident that he really was her perpetrator. So she fell victim to the misinformation effect. Her memory was reconstructed, and she developed the false memory that Ronald Cotton, she believed 100% was her perpetrator. However, Ronald Cotton was not, and while he was in the prison system, he was able to reach out to the Innocence Project, tell them his story. He got legal counsel and help, and it turned out that another man who entered the same prison as he was in was the actual perpetrator. Um, and part of what led to his conviction was that everyone, guards, other prisoners, things like that, kept confusing the two of them over and over again. And then this other man would boast about how he'd committed these crimes that he'd never been caught for. So after hearing all of this, Ronald Cotton told his investigators with the Innocence Project, I think this is the real person who committed the crime. And it turned out he was, and Ronald Cotton was able to go free. However, that was after 10 years of being in prison and wrongfully accused. And Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson have actually become very close since all of this. Ronald was able to forgive Jennifer, I would say mostly because he understood where she was coming from. They are both very well versed in false memories, and they go around and give many, many talks and speeches. They've written a book together on false memories and their story. So the two of them work together very closely today, to this day. So 200 people every day become defendants in criminal cases after being identified in a lineup. False memories of abuse, we see this, as Dr. Loftus said, this was big in the late 80s and the 90s. Patients would go in to see therapists who used specific techniques that made just kind of set up a recipe for the individual to develop false memories. So Dr. Loftus mentioned guided imagination. So basically with this technique, a therapist may say, you're telling me a lot of symptoms and a lot of stories that make it kind of seem like you may have been abused. What would it be like if you were abused? Who do you think would have done it? Can you walk me through that situation? What do you think would have happened if you were abused? All of those things. So having the person kind of be guided through imagining this potential, these events that could have taken place that actually hadn't. And as we've learned with the reconstruction hypothesis, or the construction hypothesis, sorry, if we construct a memory in our head, if we visualize something enough, it will eventually become, a memory. We'll believe it. We'll fill in the gaps, that kind of thing. So that happened a lot with guided imagination, and that led to some pretty intense accusations and lots of families being broken up. And from that, a lot of lawsuits, that kind of thing. There was one case where the victim, the client, actually won $10 million from the therapist. Another one that she mentioned, Dr. Loftus, another technique is, she said, like hypnosis, dream interpretation. So with dream interpretation, that's basically interpreting a client's dreams. Oh, you saw this color, or you had this type of figure in the dream. That must mean this, that kind of thing. And she said this particular form of psychotherapy, I believe were her words. I'm not sure what exactly she was referring to, but it sounds an awful lot like she's referring to psychoanalysis, because all of these techniques are very big in psychoanalysis. And if you look back into the research, a lot of Freud's patients that were females, after working with him, many of them reported being sexually abused by their fathers, family members, that kind of thing. So I guess this occurrence in the 80s and 90s was kind of a reoccurrence of what had happened with Freud back in the day. So a recommendation for avoiding false memories would be asking open-ended questions instead of leading ones. For instance, Loftus said that she would ask how short or how tall was the basketball player when the car smashed or hit each other. Those are very leading questions. So asking open-ended questions instead. And the cognitive interview is one way that researchers have kind of validated a form of interviewing an individual in order to avoid something like a false memory. So an example of an open-ended question would be, tell me about the car. And then maybe something a little bit more specific like, well, what color was the car? A very leading question would be asking, was the car red? Well, now you're visualing a red car, right, in your head. So now, you may think, well, I don't think it was red, or I don't remember, something like that. But if I asked you a week later, you're going to think red car. So you've kind of constructed your memory around that. So the cognitive interview was developed by Geiselman and Fisher, and there are a few main techniques with this type of interview. So you will ask the individual to mentally reinstate the environment and the personal context of the crime. So what sights did you see? What was around you? Did you hear anything? Did you have any feelings? What were your emotions? What was the weather like? So like really get back into that setting. Another step would be to report the incident from different perspectives. So what did you see? What happened? Be very open-ended. Okay, if you were a fly on the wall, what would they have seen? If you were the perpetrator, what would you have seen? Like different perspectives, that kind of thing. Recount the incident in different narrative order. So asking them to tell the story from beginning to end, from end to beginning, backwards, start in the middle, go to the end, different orders. And then report every detail, just kind of overall, no matter how trivial you feel that it is, every single detail that you can remember, report it. Okay, so as Loftus said, she'd studied false memories, and then in her later years, she began studying how can we actually purposefully implant these false memories. So she and others have implanted being lost in a mall, seeing Bugs Bunny at Disney World, which is impossible, right? Because Bugs Bunny is a Warner Brothers character, so he would never be at Disney World. So we know that that was falsely implanted because it's impossible. Almost drowning, and then food poisoning. She's also, or others have also instilled a memory of an animal attack, that kind of thing. So she's developed what she calls a recipe for implanting false memories. So as you heard at the end, she's thinking that it may be a good idea to implant false memories in, say, a child if they are struggling with obesity or something like that. So the way she would go about doing that is to convince the victim that something's happened. Get others to corroborate the event, so asking parents to agree and say, yeah, that did happen, don't you remember? There's one study with a hot air balloon ride where she actually photoshopped a picture of the participant when they were a child into the hot air balloon, so getting even more evidence for that. The individual gets convinced that it happened to them, and then you use something like guided imagination or false feedback to consolidate a really rich false memory, a visualization. That way they start to visualize the event and they really believe that it happened. There are people who are more susceptible to false memory, which we kind of touched on this earlier. So like children, people who have lapses in memory or attention, like those with dementia, that kind of thing. And then people with really vivid visual imagery, which this is interesting because Going back to kind of like hypnosis, I don't know a ton about hypnosis, but from what I have heard, which is very interesting, some people are able to be hypnotized while others are not. And there's some research indicating that those who are able to be hypnotized um, have very visual and rich imaginations. So people who are like highly emotional, that kind of stuff, are more likely to be hypnotized. Those who are in the arts, who are actors and actresses, very, very visual and very imaginative. We also see this if you do or do not believe in dissociative identity disorder, which there's a lot of controversy over that diagnosis. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. So once again, some people believe that it exists, some people don't believe. Those who do, there's some research out there suggesting that they're also the same type of people who are highly suggestible, highly imaginative, creative, the same people who could be hypnotized, but with the added component of to have DID, dissociative identity disorder, a trauma must have taken place that was so horrific that the individual's personality was literally fractured into multiple pieces. So I'm not sure if we talked about this before or not, but with like a personality disorder, you see maybe a fracture, a crack, I guess would be better, in the personality, which affects interpersonal relationships, that kind of thing. But with full-blown DID, you would see that even a step further and actual breaks into different fractions. So that's just some interesting stuff that kind of helps to tie all of this stuff together. So this, I believe, is definitely a test question, so keep it in mind. Indicators of truth are not lots of detail, confidence, or expressing something with emotion. False memories can be very, very detailed, and we can be very confident about them and very emotional about them. But that doesn't make them real. It doesn't make them true, right? So once again, there's another forum on Moodle if you'd like to make any comments, if you have any questions. Other than that, we'll meet again for class and I can answer any questions there. We'll do our recap and then we'll jump into the second half, which is language, which should be a pretty short section.